If the idea that three storms lined up on the same track can turn a dry suburban street into a death trap in under 15 minutes has you paying closer attention to your weather app, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Signal Watch so you don't miss a single update as this situation develops in real time. Drop a comment below with your location, what time it is where you are, and this. Have you or someone you know ever been caught in a flash flood somewhere that was never supposed to flood? A neighborhood, a parking lot, a road you've driven 100 times? Because that story is at the center of everything we're going to cover today. And if you want to help this community grow, share this video on X, Facebook, Reddit, or even just in your group chats. You're the reason we can keep chasing stories like this, so thank you for having our back. Now, here's what we're going to cover: a hydrological mechanism called the soil saturation cascade, and why the second storm in a training sequence is categorically more dangerous than the first, even when it's weaker. The FEMA flood map blind spot, why the neighborhoods that flood in training events are almost never the ones on the official risk maps. The collapse of warning lead time, how the window between warning issued and you are out of time shrinks from 45 minutes to under 10 in a training scenario. And the vehicle trap, why more than half of all flash flood fatalities happen inside cars, and why training floods are uniquely lethal to drivers who think the road looks fine. Now, settle in and let's get into it.
There is a line in the atmosphere right now. You can see it on the water vapor imagery if you know where to look. A boundary between air masses that has been sitting in roughly the same position for the better part of 2 days. It meanders slightly north, slightly south, but it doesn't leave. It is anchored. That line is the reason we're here. A stationary frontal boundary is not unusual. What's unusual is what happens when one persists long enough, in the right location, with the right moisture supply feeding into it from the south. Because that combination creates the conditions for one of the most underreported and consistently lethal weather phenomena in the United States. Not tornadoes, not hurricanes, not blizzards. Flash flooding, specifically the kind meteorologists call a training event. The Storm Prediction Center and the Weather Prediction Center, two of the most data-dense forecast operations in the world, both have that boundary on their maps. The WPC's Excessive Rainfall Outlook, the product specifically designed to identify where the risk of hydrologically significant rainfall is elevated, has flagged the corridor we're going to talk about today. The categorical risk level matters less than the mechanism behind it, because the mechanism is what most coverage of these setups never reaches. Here is how a training event works at the atmospheric level. The stationary boundary is a focus point for convective initiation, a line where warmer, moister air from the south undercuts cooler. Drier air from the north, and the resulting lift triggers thunderstorm development. That's not unusual. What makes a training setup different is what happens to those storms after they form. When the upper level wind pattern, the flow in the middle, and upper troposphere, typically at around 500 to 300 millibars, is oriented such that it pushes storm motion parallel to the boundary rather than across it, each successive storm cell moves along the same track. The first cell fires, moves along the boundary, and rains itself out over a specific area. The second cell fires at the same initiation point, follows the same track, and rains out over the same area. The third cell does the same, like train cars, one after another, over the same track. The Storm Prediction Center's convective outlooks characterize the wind profile that enables this kind of motion. A relatively weak steering flow at mid-levels, a low-level jet supplying continuous moisture from the Gulf, and a boundary that remains nearly stationary because the large-scale pattern is blocking any significant progression. These setups have a recognizable signature on the models. They also have a recognizable signature in the historical fatality data. What the atmospheric setup alone doesn't tell you, and what most weather coverage skips entirely, is what is simultaneously happening at the ground level, because the atmosphere is only half of this story. The other half is 6 inches underground. The boundary isn't moving. The storms are lining up, and the ground underneath that corridor is about to become the most important variable in the entire system. Because what the ground does after Storm 1 determines whether Storm 2 is a serious weather event or a catastrophe. Soil has a capacity to absorb water. It sounds obvious, But the mechanism behind that capacity, and more importantly, the mechanism behind its failure, is the thing that separates a flooding event from a training flood catastrophe. Under normal, dry conditions, suburban soil absorbs rainfall at a rate that varies by soil type and land cover, but typically falls somewhere between 1 and 2 inches per hour for the kind of well-drained loam that characterizes a lot of the residential development in the corridors where these setups tend to occur. That absorption, called infiltration, is what keeps moderate rainfall from instantly becoming surface runoff. Water soaks in, percolates down through the soil profile, recharges groundwater, and the surface stays manageable. When precipitation rates exceed infiltration capacity, you get runoff. But if the storm is moving and the rain rate is only modestly exceeding infiltration capacity for a short time, the soil rebounds quickly. It's a system with some resilience. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service has spent decades quantifying this relationship. Their curve number system, a dimensionless index that relates land surface characteristics to runoff potential, assigns values from roughly 0 to 100, where 0 represents a surface that absorbs everything, and 100 represents a surface that generates 100% runoff. A suburban residential area with good soil drainage might have a curve number in the low to mid-70s under normal antecedent moisture conditions. That means maybe 30% of rainfall becomes runoff when the soil is dry. Moderate, manageable. Here is what happens when Storm 1 runs. A training storm typically delivers 3 to 6 inches of rainfall across its track in a relatively short period, often 2 to 4 hours. That volume exceeds the soil's infiltration capacity. The soil profile saturates from the surface downward. Groundwater tables rise. Every low point in the drainage network, every creek, every retention pond, every storm sewer inlet begins filling. By the time Storm 1 has finished, the curve number for the affected area is no longer in the low to mid-70s. It's in the 90s, in some cases effectively 100, not because the soil type changed, because the soil is no longer capable of accepting any more water. The USGS National Streamflow Network, a system of more than 8,000 real-time stream gauges across the country, would show you exactly what this looks like in data. After Storm 1, river gauges in the affected watershed would be reading above bankful stage or approaching it. The floodplain is already wet. The tributary channels are already running fast. The storm sewer systems in affected municipalities are already at or near capacity. And then Storm 2 arrives. When precipitation falls on a surface where the curve number has effectively reached 100, there is no more infiltration. Every drop that falls immediately becomes surface runoff. Not most of it, not the majority, all of it. The ground is not a sponge anymore. It is a parking lot. And the runoff that the parking lot generates moves immediately into an already stressed drainage system, a system of streams and storm sewers that is already handling the tail end of Storm 1's discharge. This is the mechanism that transforms a serious weather event into a training flood disaster. And it is the mechanism that the flood maps, the official, government-issued, mortgage-required flood maps, are almost entirely blind to. Dr. Jonathan Gorley of the NOAA National Severe Storms Laboratory has spent years studying exactly this problem. His research on flash flood hydrology consistently identifies antecedent soil moisture conditions as one of the primary determinants of flash flood magnitude, sometimes more important than the rainfall rate itself. A storm delivering 4 inches of rain on saturated soil can produce more dangerous flooding than a storm delivering 6 inches on dry soil. The ground is the variable. The ground is what training storms weaponize. The stream gauges are telling that story right now, but the maps on the wall in most emergency management offices aren't. The Federal Emergency Management Agency administers the National Flood Insurance Program, and as part of that program, it produces flood insurance rate maps, the official, legally binding delineation of flood risk across the United States. If your property is in a special flood hazard area on a FEMA map, your mortgage lender requires you to carry flood insurance. If your property is outside that zone, you're considered low risk. The map says so. Those maps are built on a specific methodology. They use historical precipitation records to calculate the probability that a given location will experience flooding in any given year. The 1% annual chance flood, commonly called the 100-year flood, is the standard design threshold for the special flood hazard area designation. The maps model river behavior and floodplain inundation based on single event precipitation scenarios. They incorporate topography, channel geometry, and in many updated areas, hydraulic modeling of channel and floodplain capacity. What they do not incorporate at any meaningful level is compound sequential flooding. They do not model what happens when 3 storms follow the same track with the soil already saturated from the first. They do not account for antecedent moisture conditions as a systematic variable. They are, by design, built around the probability distribution of individual events, not the probability distribution of training sequences. The result is a map that misidentifies flood risk in precisely the areas that training events tend to affect most severely. The Association of State Floodplain Managers, the professional organization of the people who actually work with these maps every day, has documented this gap extensively. Their analyses consistently show that a significant fraction of flood damage claims and flood fatalities occur outside the designated special flood hazard area. The specific figure varies by event and geography, but multiple studies across different training flood events have found that somewhere between 40 and 60% of flash flood fatalities occur in areas that FEMA's maps classify as low or moderate risk. Let that picture develop for a moment. More than 4 in 10 people who die in flash floods die in places that the official government map says they don't need to worry much about. The First Street Foundation, a nonprofit research organization that has developed its own national flood risk model using higher resolution data and more sophisticated hydrological methods, estimates that approximately 14.6 million properties across the United States face substantial flood risk that is not reflected in FEMA's current flood maps. Their model accounts for a broader range of precipitation scenarios, more recent land use and land cover data, and, critically, a better representation of compound flooding dynamics. There is also the update problem. Many FEMA flood maps covering communities in training flood vulnerable corridors are 15 to 25 years old. They were produced before significant residential and commercial development occurred in headwater areas that are now major contributors to flash flood runoff. They do not reflect the current curve number of the watershed, because the watershed looks fundamentally different than it did when the maps were drawn. This is not a conspiracy. It is a resource constraint compounded by a regulatory timeline. FEMA has a finite budget for map updates, and the process of producing a new flood study for a single community can take years and cost millions of dollars. The result, in practice, is that the maps that most Americans use to make decisions about flood insurance, home purchase, and evacuation are calibrated for a world that no longer exists and are fundamentally miscalibrated for the specific type of event we are watching develop right now. So the ground is saturated. The maps say you're fine, and the warning system that is supposed to give you time to act is running on a timeline that training floods systematically compress. The National Weather Service issues flash flood warnings through a network of 122 weather forecast offices across the United States and its territories. Each office has a team of operational meteorologists monitoring radar, model output, stream gauge data, and field reports in real time. When the data crosses certain thresholds, specific rainfall rates, gauge readings, or a combination of factors, a forecaster makes a decision, issue the warning. The average lead time for a flash flood warning in the United States, the gap between when the warning is issued and when flooding begins, is approximately 45 minutes according to NWS performance metrics. 45 minutes is not a lot of time, but it is enough time to move to higher ground if you know what to do with it and you act immediately. Training events break the 45-minute average in a specific and dangerous way. In a standard single event flash flood, the forecaster has a recognizable pattern to work with. Rain rate is elevated. The gauge is rising. The model shows continued forcing. There's time to see the threat develop, process the data, and issue the warning before the worst of the flooding occurs. The sequence, observe, analyze, warn, respond, has time to function. In a training event, by the time Storm 2 arrives, the drainage system is already full from Storm 1. The response time of the watershed has changed. Instead of the gauge rising over several hours as rain accumulates and drainage systems fill from empty, the gauge responds almost instantly to new rainfall because it was already near capacity. The time from rain begins to flooding begins collapses dramatically. Research on rapid onset flash flooding, the category that training events most often produce during their second and third phases, documents cases where the warning lead time was less than 10 minutes, 8 minutes, sometimes less. In those cases, the warning goes out, and by the time the emergency alert system message clears on someone's phone, the intersection they drive through every morning already has 2 feet of moving water across it. The multi-radar multi-sensor system, MRMS, represents the most sophisticated rainfall estimation technology that NWS operates. It integrates data from all 143 radar sites in the national network, satellite data, rain gauge observations, and numerical model output to produce a near real-time, high-resolution picture of rainfall rates and accumulations across the country. It updates every 2 minutes. It is genuinely impressive technology. But MRMS is an observation system. It measures what has already fallen. It cannot tell you that the soil at a specific location reached saturation 17 minutes ago, and that the next quarter inch of rain will immediately translate to a 1-foot rise on the local creek. That connection between rainfall observation and flood consequence requires the forecaster to be integrating gauge data, upstream observations, and knowledge of antecedent conditions. Simultaneously, in real time, under the pressure of an evolving severe weather situation. Dr. Jonathan Gorley's work at the NOAA National Severe Storms Laboratory has been pushing toward exactly this capability, a flash flood guidance system that accounts for antecedent soil moisture in real time, narrowing the gap between rainfall observation and accurate flood impact prediction. The system exists in experimental form. It is not yet fully operational across the national warning network. In the meantime, the warning that goes out during Storm 2 of a training sequence is operating on the same clock as it always has. The ground is operating on a different clock entirely. And the road, the neighborhood, the parking lot that looks fine at 8:47 in the morning does not look the same at 8:55. But there is one more factor that the warning clock doesn't account for. Even when the warning goes out in time, there is one behavior pattern that kills people in flash floods with remarkable consistency. One decision that people make because it seems reasonable and almost always isn't. They get in their cars. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has been studying flash flood fatality patterns for decades. The number that defines the problem, the number that explains why flash floods kill more people in an average year than tornadoes or hurricanes, is this: more than half of all flash flood fatalities in the United States occur in vehicles, not in houses, not in low-lying areas that everyone knows flood, in cars, on roads that looked passable. The physics are not ambiguous. 6 inches of moving water, 6 inches, less than the height of a standard brick, is sufficient to knock an adult off their feet. 12 inches of moving water will carry a small car. 2 feet of moving water will carry most SUVs, pickup trucks, and minivans. The force exerted by moving water is proportional to the square of its velocity. A flash flood moving at 15 miles per hour exerts more than 4 times the force of the same depth of standing water. The engine compartment of a vehicle provides significant buoyancy. A car can float before the driver realizes the depth is sufficient to float it. The National Weather Service has run the Turnaround, Don't Drown campaign since 2003. The message is clear. The data is clear. The problem is that human perception of moving water depth from inside a vehicle, looking through a windshield at a road surface that is partially submerged, is systematically and dangerously inaccurate. People underestimate the depth. They underestimate the velocity. They have driven through that intersection in the rain before. They are in a hurry. The road looks manageable. Training floods create a specific version of this trap that is worse than a standard flash flood in one important way. Between Storm 1 and Storm 2, in the lull when rainfall has stopped but drainage hasn't yet cleared, roads that flooded during Storm 1 partially drain. Not fully, but enough to look different, enough to look like the worst might be over. Drivers who sheltered in place during Storm 1 may decide that the window between storms is their opportunity to move, to check on family, to get somewhere, and they are on the road when Storm 2's runoff arrives. The road they just drove through without incident 30 minutes ago is now a different road. The soil is fully saturated, the storm sewers are full, the creek under the road is running at or above bank full, and the new rainfall from Storm 2 has nowhere to go except across the road surface, directly into the vehicle lane, with no warning and no time. More than half of all flash flood deaths. In cars, on roads that someone decided were drivable. That is the baseline. That is the mortality pattern before you account for a third storm arriving on an already saturated system, while emergency resources are stretched from 2 prior events, while the public believes the worst is over. What you don't know yet,
what we haven't gotten to, is what the hydrology looks like when Storm 2 hits a drainage network that is already carrying Storm 1's discharge. Because the numbers from that scenario are the ones that should change how you think about every training forecast you see for the rest of your life.
Picture a rain gauge in the parking lot of a church on a residential street, the kind of neighborhood with sidewalks and a community pool, not a neighborhood anyone thinks of as flood-prone. The gauge read 0.0 inches for the 2 hours between the end of Storm 1's heaviest rain and the beginning of Storm 2's approach. The road in front of the church was wet. The grass was wet. A few low spots in the parking lot had shallow puddles. Someone drove through without hesitation. Then Storm 2's leading edge arrived. The rainfall rate wasn't extraordinary by convective standards. Call it 2 inches per hour, a rate the atmosphere produces in moderate to heavy thunderstorms with some regularity. On a dry summer afternoon, 2 inches per hour for 90 minutes would fill that parking lot's storm drain inlets to capacity and send some water sheeting across the parking lot surface. Inconvenient, not dangerous. On a watershed where Storm 1 has already driven the NRCS curve number to 98, where the soil's infiltration capacity is functionally 0, 2 inches per hour generates near total surface runoff from the moment the first drop lands. There is no buffer, no absorption period, no gradual ramp-up of the runoff hydrograph. The watershed responds instantaneously because it has no capacity left to delay. The USGS stream gauge network documents exactly this behavior in training event after training event. In single event flooding, the hydrograph, the graph of stream discharge over time, shows a gradual rise as rainfall accumulates and the watershed's drainage network fills from the upstream tributaries down. The time between peak rainfall intensity and peak stream discharge, called the lag time, can be anywhere from 1 hour to several hours, depending on watershed size and soil conditions. In the second event of a training sequence, the lag time compresses dramatically. In well-documented training cases, gauges have shown stage rises of 8 to 12 feet in under 2 hours during the second event, rises that would have taken 4 to 6 hours to develop from the same rainfall total on a dry watershed. The watershed isn't filtering the storm anymore. It's transmitting it. Every drop lands, runs, and arrives at the stream channel almost simultaneously across the entire drainage area. The channel that was at bankful stage, the condition where water fills the channel to its banks without yet overflowing, at the end of Storm 1 is now receiving a pulse of runoff that matches or exceeds what the 100-year design event would produce. Not because Storm 2 is a 100-year storm, because the watershed has been transformed by Storm 1 into a near-impervious surface that magnifies every storm to its maximum possible flood expression. The gauges are spiking, the channels are overflowing, and the water is going somewhere the storm sewer network was never designed to handle. Every storm sewer system, every culvert, every retention basin, every drainage channel in the United States was designed to a standard. That standard is typically expressed in terms of return period, a statistical way of describing how often a storm of a given intensity is expected to occur. The 10-year storm, the 25-year storm, the 100-year storm, most municipal storm sewer infrastructure, the pipes under residential streets, the catch basins at intersections, the culverts under suburban roads, is designed to handle what hydrologists call the 10-year return period storm. A storm whose intensity is statistically expected to occur, on average, once in a 10-year period. In practical terms, depending on geographic location, this typically means the system was designed to handle roughly 3 to 4 inches of rainfall in a 6-hour period without significant surface flooding. The American Society of Civil Engineers documents this reality in its Infrastructure Report Card, a comprehensive assessment of the state of American public infrastructure updated every 4 years. The drainage category is consistently graded poorly, reflecting both the age of existing systems and the inadequacy of design standards that haven't been updated to reflect current precipitation climatology. Here's the training storm problem embedded in that design standard. 3 to 4 inches in 6 hours is the design threshold. A training event, 3 storms each delivering 3 to 4 inches across a 12 to 18-hour period, tracking the same corridor, delivers 9 to 12 inches across that same drainage area, with the second and third pulses arriving on fully saturated soil and generating near total runoff. The storm sewer system is encountering an effective precipitation load that is roughly 3 to 4 times its design capacity, and it is encountering that load not gradually, but in rapid pulses, each of which arrives faster than the prior event drained. NOAA's Atlas 14, the authoritative reference for precipitation frequency data in the United States, documents the actual rainfall intensities associated with different return periods across every part of the country. In many regions, the training event rainfall totals we're describing, 9 to 12 inches across 18 hours on the same watershed, would nominally fall somewhere in the range of a 500 to 1,000 year return period event for a single storm. But because the training mechanism involves 3 distinct storms that are individually within much more common return periods, the compound event flies below the statistical radar. No single storm qualifies for the extreme designation. The sum of 3 moderate storms on saturated soil creates an event that the infrastructure was designed to experience once in 1,000 years, or never. There's one more factor that the original design engineers couldn't fully account for. The watershed has changed since the pipes were put in the ground. Suburban and exurban development has replaced forest, grassland, and agricultural land with rooftops, parking lots, and roads, surfaces that generate near total runoff under any precipitation intensity, regardless of antecedent conditions. The EPA's stormwater management research consistently shows that the impervious surface fraction in developed suburban areas typically ranges from 40 to 60% of total land area. Forest and agricultural land in the same geography might have impervious fractions of 5 to 15%. Each percentage point of impervious surface conversion meaningfully increases the peak discharge rate and reduces the lag time for a watershed. The storm sewer system that was undersized when it was installed serves a watershed that has become progressively harder on it with every new subdivision, every new parking lot, every new section of road. When Storm 2's runoff arrives at an already overloaded storm sewer system, the system doesn't fail gradually. It surcharges. Water backs up through the inlets and manholes. Streets become channels. Parking lots become retention basins. And the flow path of that water is determined not by anyone's flood map, but by pure topography. Water moves downhill along the path of least resistance, regardless of what the zoning codes say about where it's supposed to go. But the physical infrastructure failure, as serious as it is still only the consequence of a meteorological mechanism that most people have never heard explained. Because the question everyone needs answered right now is the one that the forecast models are struggling with. Why does the boundary stay in the same place long enough for this to happen? The stationary frontal boundary that anchors a training sequence isn't stationary because nothing is happening in the atmosphere. It's stationary because 2 opposing forces have reached a temporary equilibrium. And the equilibrium is being maintained by a large-scale pressure pattern that resists the kinds of changes that would normally push the boundary north or south. The upper-level trough, a southward dip in the jet stream pattern, provides the large-scale forcing that initiates and sustains convection along the boundary. But troughs come in different configurations. A sharp, fast-moving trough drives storm systems east quickly, pulling boundaries along with them and preventing the kind of geographic repetition that characterizes training. The setups that produce training events tend to feature broader, slower-moving troughs, or what meteorologists call a negatively tilted trough in more extreme cases, that allow the boundary to linger while continuing to focus convective development. The moisture supply is the second critical ingredient. The low-level jet, a relatively narrow, fast corridor of wind, typically flowing from the south-southwest at altitudes of roughly 1 to 2 kilometers above the surface, acts as an atmospheric pipeline, transporting warm, moist Gulf air northward and supplying the boundary region with the fuel it needs to keep firing new convective cells. Low-level jet wind speeds and active training setups typically run from 30 to 70 knots, meaning the atmosphere is continuously refreshing its moisture supply from a vast reservoir to the south. One measure of that moisture reservoir's state is precipitable water, the total depth of water vapor in an atmospheric column expressed as an equivalent depth of liquid water. Climatological average precipitable water values for much of the central and eastern United States in summer range from roughly 1 to 1.5 inches. During training event setups, precipitable water values frequently exceed 2 inches, a value roughly double the climatological average. That excess moisture, continuously supplied by the low-level jet and lifted along the stationary boundary, is what each successive storm cell draws on as it fires and tracks along the boundary. The mechanism that keeps the cells tracking the same geographic corridor is called back-building convection, a process documented extensively in the academic literature on mesoscale convective systems. In a back-building MCS, new convective cells develop preferentially on the upwind flank of the system, where low-level inflow is strongest and atmospheric instability is least depleted. These new cells then move in the direction of the mid-level steering flow, which, in a training setup, is oriented nearly parallel to the boundary. The result is a continuous, self-regenerating system that repeatedly delivers convective cells to the same geographic corridor. Dr. Robert Howes, a University of Washington meteorologist who has spent decades studying the structure and behavior of mesoscale convective systems, has documented how these back-building organizations can persist for 12, 18, even 24 hours under the right large-scale forcing conditions. The system is essentially feeding on itself. New cells forming at the expense of the instability on the leading edge of the system, moving through the corridor and raining out while fresh cells fire behind them. And this is where the investigation takes a turn that most coverage of flash floods never reaches. Because the event that most definitively demonstrated the lethal power of this mechanism happened not once, but twice at the same location on 2 different dates separated by less than 2 years. And the second event produced more damage than the first, despite delivering measurably less rain. Ellicott City, Maryland, a historic mill town built in a river valley at the confluence of the Tiber and Hudson branches, 2 small streams draining a steep headwater watershed of approximately 3.6 square miles. Charming, historic, a destination, and a near-perfect hydrological trap. July 30th, 2016, 6.6 inches of rain in 2 hours. The streets became rivers. Storefronts were gutted. 2 people died. $100 million in damage. The event was called unprecedented, impossible, a once-in-a-thousand-years occurrence that no one could have predicted or prepared for. May 27th, 2018, less total rainfall, measurably less, a storm that, by precipitation totals alone, would have been considered significant but not catastrophic. 2 people died again. Damage estimates climbed toward $250 million. The second event was worse, not because the storm was worse, because the watershed remembered the first one. The 2018 Ellicott City event is the most important case study in American training flood history, and not because of its scale, because of what it teaches about the gap between unprecedented and unrepeatable. After the 2016 flood, Howard County, Maryland commissioned a comprehensive hydrological study of the Tiber-Hudson watershed. The study confirmed what any look at the topography would suggest. The watershed's geometry is almost perfectly designed to concentrate rainfall into a narrow, confined channel that runs directly through the heart of Main Street. The watershed is steep, significant elevation change over a short horizontal distance, meaning water moves quickly once it starts moving. The watershed is small, 3.6 square miles, meaning the time of concentration, the time for runoff to travel from the farthest point in the watershed to the outlet is measured in minutes rather than hours. And the watershed drains through a channel that narrows dramatically as it passes through the historic built environment of Main Street, where 19th century stone buildings line both sides of the channel on a 900-foot corridor. Dr. Claire Welty, a hydrologist at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who has studied the Tiber-Hudson watershed extensively, characterized the system as one with essentially zero margin for error. The channel capacity is fixed by the historic architecture. The response time is fixed by the watershed geometry. The impervious surface fraction in the headwater areas had increased significantly in the decades before 2016, driven by commercial and residential development that replaced forest and farmland with rooftops and parking lots. USGS peak flow measurements from the 2016 event showed discharge rates that were extraordinary for a watershed of that size. The 2018 event, with less total precipitation, produced a peak discharge that was nearly as high because the watershed was wetter at the start and because the drainage system was already partially stressed when the rain began. Howard County's response to the two events was comprehensive and controversial. A flood mitigation plan estimated at $250 million involved a combination of upstream detention basins, channel modifications, building demolitions along the most vulnerable section of Main Street, and property acquisitions. The demolitions, the removal of historic structures that had stood for more than a century, ignited fierce debate about whether the goal was to save the town or to transform it into something unrecognizable. The mitigation plan addresses the specific geometry of the Tiber-Hudson watershed. It does not address the hundreds of other small, steep, urbanized watersheds across the mid-Atlantic, the Appalachian foothills, the Ozarks, and the Front Range of the Rockies that share the same topographic signature. Ellicott City is not a quirk. It is a template, and it is a template that the current storm setup is capable of activating in watersheds that have never experienced an event large enough to reveal the vulnerability. The question that matters now, for this event today, is how many Ellicott cities are sitting under the track of this training sequence. How many small, steep, historic watersheds have the geometry and the impervious surface fraction that makes them capable of catastrophic response to a training flood? And how many of them are on flood maps that were drawn before the most recent cycle of development changed the watershed fundamentally? The geographic typology of training flood vulnerable watersheds is specific enough to be mappable, and alarming enough, once mapped, to explain why training events consistently produce fatalities in locations that surprise emergency managers and the public alike. The signature features a small to medium headwater basin, typically 2 to 15 square miles in contributing area, with significant topographic relief, meaning meaningful elevation change concentrated in a relatively short distance. High impervious surface fraction in the headwater areas, the development pattern that maximizes runoff and minimizes lag time. A confined valley channel, often constrained by historic development that predates modern floodplain management standards, and a downstream community, often a historic downtown, a commercial district, or a dense residential area that sits at the base of the watershed gradient, receiving all of the accumulated runoff. This geographic template appears repeatedly across the training flood fatality record. Fort Collins, Colorado, Ellicott City, Maryland, Big Thompson Canyon, Colorado, Centennial, West Virginia, Rapid City, South Dakota, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Kinston, North Carolina. The specifics of each event differ. The watershed geometry is strikingly consistent. The Appalachian foothills from Alabama to Pennsylvania are dense with this template. Small watersheds draining historic mill towns and river valleys. The Ozarks in Missouri and Arkansas have similar geometry. The Front Range of the Rockies, where small, steep drainages descend from the foothills into rapidly urbanizing communities at their base, presents the same pattern. The Mid-Atlantic Piedmont region, with its concentration of historic towns built at the fall line between mountains and coastal plain, is particularly well represented. The First Street Foundation's 5th National Risk Assessment, published with detailed property-level flood risk modeling, estimates that approximately 14.6 million properties across the United States face substantial flood risk that FEMA's current maps do not capture. A significant fraction of these properties are in exactly the watershed geometry described above. Small, steep, urbanized basins where training flood events produce consequences that no single event probability map would predict. The Association of State Floodplain Managers has produced gap analyses showing the scale of this mismatch. The difference between properties that FEMA designates as high risk and properties that more sophisticated modeling identifies as facing substantial real-world flood risk. The gap is not a rounding error. It represents millions of homeowners who have made financial and safety decisions based on flood risk assessments that do not account for the event type that is currently developing along a fixed atmospheric track.
The watershed is set. The soil is saturated. Storm 1 has delivered its load. Storm 2 is running. And somewhere along the track of this training sequence, in a small valley, on a historic main street, on a suburban road that has flooded exactly 0 times in 30 years of local memory, Storm 3 is still coming. And that is the part of this story that most people have never had to think about before.
Emergency management is not a bottomless resource. It is a specific set of people, vehicles, boats, radios, and decision-making capacity, and it can be depleted. After Storm 1 runs through a training corridor, the local emergency management picture looks something like this. Swift water rescue teams have been deployed. Search and rescue personnel have been working in physically demanding conditions. Fast-moving water, debris, darkness, disoriented people. The Emergency Communications Center is handling call volume well above its normal operational load. Roads that are storm sewer surcharged are closed, creating routing problems for response vehicles. The Emergency Operations Center has been activated and is making resource allocation decisions in real time with incomplete information. After Storm 2, all of those conditions are worse. The swift water rescue teams are exhausted. Some may have been working for 16 to 20 hours. The road closure network has expanded. The call volume hasn't dropped. Equipment that works in moving water has been exposed to moving water for an extended period. And the disaster declaration process, the formal FEMA individual assistance request that unlocks federal resources, has a processing timeline measured in days, not hours, meaning those resources are still days away. And then Storm 3 begins. The Nashville flood of May 1st and 2nd, 2010, is one of the most thoroughly documented compound flood events in American history, and the fatigue dynamic is one of its clearest lessons. The event involved 2 rounds of severe thunderstorms, the second arriving before the first had drained, producing rainfall totals of 13 to 17 inches across portions of Middle Tennessee in approximately 36 hours. The Cumberland River crested at 51.9 feet, more than 12 feet above flood stage, the highest recorded level since 1842. 53 direct flood fatalities, $11 billion in damage. The Tennessee Emergency Management Agency's after-action report on the Nashville flood explicitly documents the resource exhaustion problem. Swift water rescue assets that had been fully committed during the first round of flooding were unavailable or compromised when the second round arrived. Response times degraded. Some areas that could have been evacuated before the second flood wave were not, because the personnel and equipment that would have executed that evacuation were still committed to the first event. The Iowa flooding of late June through early July 2008, a multi-week compound flood event involving successive waves across the Cedar River Basin, produced a related but distinct version of fatigue. Over the course of nearly 2 weeks, Communities that had received the worst flooding in their recorded history evacuated, returned to assess damage, and then been told to evacuate again. The psychological toll, the decision fatigue, the resource exhaustion, the disruption of the normal social structures that enable collective action was documented extensively in subsequent research on community resilience. Dr. Eve Gruntfest, who has spent decades studying flash flood warning compliance and public response, has documented a consistent pattern in multi-event sequences. Compliance rates with evacuation orders and warnings declined significantly after the first event if it did not produce the worst outcomes people feared. People who sheltered in place during Storm 1 experienced significant but survivable flooding and emerged with their property damaged but intact often make the calculation, consciously or not, that they know what this is now. They've survived it once. They'll survive it again. That calculation is dangerous in any compound flood event. In a training event, where Storm 3 arrives on soil and drainage systems that are categorically more stressed than anything Storm 1 encountered, it can be lethal. The third storm doesn't arrive into the same situation as the first. It arrives into a community that is physically compromised, institutionally strained, and psychologically fatigued. And it arrives on a watershed that has been transformed by the first two events into the most flood-amplifying surface it has ever been. The operational numerical weather prediction models that NWS forecasters use to anticipate training events have improved dramatically over the past 2 decades. They have not improved fast enough. The fundamental challenge is scale. A training event's most important atmospheric feature, the precise location and persistence of the stationary frontal boundary, and the exact point along that boundary where convective initiation will occur, unfolds at spatial scales of 1 to 5 kilometers. The interactions between the boundary, the local terrain, the moisture gradient, and the upper level forcing that determine exactly where and when each successive cell fires are among the most complex phenomena in operational meteorology. The Global Forecast System, the GFS, the primary American global model, operates at a horizontal grid spacing of approximately 13 kilometers. It captures the large-scale pattern, the trough, the boundary, the general moisture supply. It does not resolve the fine-scale convective processes that determine the boundary's exact behavior. The boundary in the GFS is a smeared, smooth structure. In reality, it is a complex three-dimensional interface with significant small-scale variability that determines precisely where the storms fire. The High-Resolution Rapid Refresh Model, HRR, pronounced HER in operational forecast culture, represents the current state of the art for short-range convective guidance in the United States. Developed at NOAA's Earth System Research Laboratories under Dr. Stan Benjamin's leadership, the HRRR runs at 3-kilometer grid spacing and updates every hour, assimilating the most recent radar, satellite, and surface observation data. In the 6 to 12-hour forecast window, it is substantially better than the GFS at resolving convective initiation, storm evolution, and precipitation distribution. But documentation of HRRR performance in training events reveals a consistent limitation. In the final 6 hours before peak intensity in documented training cases, the HRRR has shown tendencies to underestimate the rainfall totals in the heaviest training corridor by 30 to 50%. The reason is embedded in the physics, the back-building convective process, where new cells continuously regenerate on the upwind flank, involves convective scale interactions at the 1-kilometer scale and below. Even the HRRER doesn't fully resolve those interactions. It captures the general behavior. It misses the precise magnitude. For a flash flood forecast, the difference between 3 inches and 5 inches, a 30 to 40% underestimate, is the difference between a serious but manageable event and a catastrophic one. It is the difference between a flood watch and a flash flood emergency. It is the difference between a warning issued with 45 minutes of lead time and a warning issued after the water is already moving. NWS performance verification statistics on flash flood warnings show improvement year over year. The probability of detection, the fraction of flash flood events that receive a warning before flooding begins, has risen to roughly 90% for significant events. The false alarm ratio has declined. These are genuine improvements earned through better modeling, better remote sensing, and better forecaster training. But probability of detection is not the same as lead time. A warning issued 3 minutes before the flood peak has a probability of detection of 100% and a lead time of 3 minutes. In a training event where the drainage system is already fully saturated and the watershed is transmitting rainfall to the channel with near zero lag, the window between warning issued and flood peak arrived can be measured in minutes that don't leave enough time for the full warning receipt decision action sequence to complete. The models are getting better. The physics of the event is getting harder to model as climate shifts, precipitation, intensity distributions, and the gap between what the models can reliably predict and what decision makers need to act in time is the operational frontier of flash flood science right now. In 2020, NOAA conducted survey research on flood risk perception among Americans living in areas the agency considered flood prone. The results were consistent with decades of social science research on natural hazard risk perception, and they documented a problem that is structural, not individual. Approximately 40% of the surveyed population in flood-prone areas reported not believing they personally faced significant flood risk. 40%. In areas that hydrological data identified as flood-prone. The disconnect between the objective risk and the perceived risk was not random. It had a clear pattern. People were using a mental model built from available information, and the most available information was FEMA's flood zone map. The mental model works like this. The flood zone is the flood zone. If my property is not in the designated high-risk area, the special flood hazard area with the mandatory insurance requirement, then I am not in the flood zone, and therefore I am not at risk of significant flooding. The map is the fact. This mental model is not irrational, given the information environment. The flood zone map is the most visible, most widely referenced, most legally significant flood risk communication tool in American life. It governs insurance requirements. It appears on property disclosures. Mortgage lenders reference it. The mental model that emerges from this information environment, that designated flood zones are where floods happen and everywhere else is where they don't, is a reasonable inference from the available evidence. It is catastrophically wrong in the context of a training flood. Dr. Susan Joslin, a University of Washington cognitive psychologist who studies weather forecast communication, has documented how this kind of categorical, map-based risk communication creates decision-making shortcuts that are difficult to override even when more specific and accurate information is available. When someone receives a flash flood warning for their area and their mental model says, "But I'm not in the flood zone," the warning competes against a deeply embedded prior belief. The warning often loses. The National Flood Insurance Program's own policy take-up data illustrates the financial dimension of this problem. In FEMA's highest risk zones, the AE and VE designations, where insurance is federally required for federally backed mortgages, policy take-up rates are relatively high because the legal requirement drives purchase. In the moderate risk B, C, and X zones, the zones where 40 to 60% of actual flash flood fatalities occur, NFIP policy take-up rates are dramatically lower. People in those zones have not been given the information or the incentive structure that would lead them to insure. And the specific event we're discussing, a training flood that produces catastrophic flash flooding in areas outside the special flood hazard area, is precisely the event type that the mental model most severely underestimates. There is no prior local experience to draw on. There is no flood zone map to confirm the danger. The warning, when it comes, is asking people to respond to a threat they've never experienced and never believed was possible in their neighborhood. The question is whether the warning language itself, the specific words that come out of the National Weather Service in the minutes before the water arrives, is equipped to break through that prior belief quickly enough to matter. The standard National Weather Service flash flood warning reads something like this: flash flood warning in effect until a specific time for specific counties. A flash flood warning means flash flooding is imminent or occurring. If you are in a flood-prone area, move to higher ground now. Do not attempt to cross flooded roadways. That language is accurate. It is professionally written. It has been refined over decades of operational experience, and research consistently suggests it is insufficient to produce the behavioral response it aims for in the time frame available during a training event. Dr. Joseph Traynor of the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center has spent years studying warning compliance, the factors that determine whether a person who receives a warning takes the protective action it recommends. His research identifies several variables that consistently predict compliance: specificity of the threat, specificity of the recommended action, credibility of the source, and social confirmation from trusted personal contacts. Standard flash flood warning language performs well on source credibility. It performs poorly on specificity of threat because the standard warning doesn't tell you that your specific road, your specific neighborhood, your specific drainage basin is the one that is facing imminent flooding. It covers a county or a portion of a county, which might include terrain that ranges from a 100-year flood zone to a neighborhood that has never flooded in its recorded history. The National Weather Service has a mechanism for the most extreme events, the flash flood emergency, previously called the particularly dangerous situation, flash flood warning. This designation, which requires forecaster assessment that a life-threatening situation is imminent, includes stronger language, specifically the phrase, "This is an extremely dangerous and life-threatening situation." It is also among the most infrequently used NWS products. Across the entire country, NWS offices issue approximately 20 to 40 flash flood emergencies per year. That is fewer than 5% of all flash flood events, a calibration that reflects both the high threshold for the designation and the resource concern that overuse degrades its impact. Research from the National Academies of Sciences 2020 report on science communication supports a finding that has significant implications for how training events should be communicated. Adding specific action language to a warning increases compliance by approximately 20 to 30% over standard advisory language. Not move to higher ground, but move to the upper floors of your building right now. Do not wait. And here, the investigation needs to step back from the institutional picture for a moment and address something directly. Because in the online space where this information circulates, there is a fringe narrative about training storms and flash floods that deserves an honest answer rather than dismissal. The claim, in its various forms, goes something like this: training storms don't happen naturally. The precision of the track, the repetition of the corridor, the geographic specificity of the flooding, these are too exact to be coincidence. Weather modification technology, HARP, cloud seeding programs, these are directing storms along specific corridors to flood specific communities. I want to address this directly because it deserves an honest answer grounded in physics. A single moderate thunderstorm, not an exceptional one, a run-of-the-mill summer convective cell, releases approximately 10 to the 17th joules of energy. That is roughly the energy equivalent of 10 nuclear weapons. The stationary frontal boundary that anchors a training sequence spans hundreds of miles and is maintained by continental-scale pressure gradient forces that dwarf the energy output of any technology humanity has ever constructed. The idea that any existing or plausible technology could direct that energy along a specific geographic corridor repeatedly for 18 plus hours is not merely implausible. It exceeds any engineering scale humanity has approached by orders of magnitude. Cloud seeding, the most sophisticated legitimate weather modification technology in operational use, enhances precipitation by roughly 10 to 15% under specific atmospheric conditions. It requires pre-existing cloud systems with the right microphysical properties. It cannot create storms from clear air. It cannot fix the position of a frontal boundary. It cannot direct a back-building mesoscale convective system along a predetermined track. The real human fingerprint in training floods is not malicious. It is mundane. It is 40 years of impervious surface expansion in headwater watersheds. It is storm sewer infrastructure, designed to 1970s precipitation climatology. It is FEMA flood maps that haven't been updated since the Reagan administration. It is development approvals granted without adequate hydrological analysis of compound event risk. The ordinary decisions of ordinary governance, compounded over decades, have made training floods more dangerous than they would otherwise be. That story doesn't need embellishment. The ordinary physics is alarming enough.
The warning language is inadequate, the maps are wrong, the mental model is broken, the institutional failures are real. All of that is documented, verifiable, and directly relevant to what is happening right now with this storm setup. That is the investigation. That is the story.
The atmospheric setup exists. The boundary is in place. The storms are lining up. What happens next depends on variables that the models are resolving in real time. And the honest answer to how bad will this be is that the range of outcomes is genuinely wide. There are 3 ways to read what the data is showing right now. Not because the evidence is ambiguous, it isn't, but because the specific details that determine which outcome materializes are still within the forecast uncertainty envelope. Presenting only the worst case scenario would be as misleading as presenting only the best case. This is what the data actually supports. Interpretation 1. The boundary proves less persistent than the current pattern suggests. A subtle shift in the upper level wind pattern, a slight acceleration of the mid-level flow, a modest strengthening of the surface pressure gradient, nudges the boundary enough to shift each successive storm's track by 20 to 30 miles. Instead of 3 storms following the same corridor, they follow slightly offset corridors, each hitting a distinct drainage basin. The flooding is significant, potentially locally severe, but it is distributed rather than concentrated. Each drainage basin receives 1 training pulse rather than 3. The soil saturation cascade develops along the first storm's track, but not the subsequent ones. The infrastructure is stressed, but not overwhelmed. The warning system has time to function, with something approaching its average lead times. Fatalities are possible, but not at the scale that the full training scenario would produce. The evidence supporting this interpretation: forecast model ensemble spread, showing non-trivial variability in boundary position over the next 48 hours. Historical cases where similar setups produced distributed rather than concentrated training flooding due to boundary wobble. Interpretation 2. The boundary holds long enough for 2 of the 3 storms to significantly overlap in their tracks. One watershed, the right combination of small basin, steep gradient, high impervious fraction, receives the full 2-storm training sequence. The soil saturation cascade develops completely. The infrastructure is overwhelmed. Flash flooding reaches the scale that the USGS gauge record would later classify as a significant exceedance of the 100-year design event. Emergency resources respond to a localized catastrophic event while simultaneously managing lesser flooding elsewhere along the boundary. Warning lead time in the affected watershed compresses to the range of 8 to 15 minutes. Vehicle entrapments occur on roads that appeared passable between the 2 storm peaks. Infrastructure damage is severe. Fatalities are possible, particularly in the vehicle entrapment scenario. The evidence supporting this interpretation: current HRRR runs showing 2 of the 3 storms tracking with meaningful overlap across a specific corridor. Boundary persistence forecast. Confidence extending through the next 24 hours. Precipitable water values in the 2 to 2.5 inch range, supporting high precipitation efficiency convection. Interpretation 3. The boundary holds through the full sequence. All 3 storms track the same corridor with less than 6 hours between each. Multiple small watersheds along the corridor enter the fully saturated near-zero infiltration state simultaneously. Flash flooding occurs in locations with no prior flood history in the local record. Warning lead times collapse below 10 minutes in affected areas. In some cases, warnings are confirmed by the flooding itself before anyone in the warning path has acted. Vehicle entrapments on apparently passable roads account for a significant fraction of the response burden. Emergency resources already stretched from storms 1 and 2 are unable to reach all entrapment locations simultaneously. Infrastructure damage is severe and widespread. The fatality count is determined in significant part by how many people are in vehicles, how many heeded the warnings from the first two storms, and how quickly mutual aid resources from adjacent jurisdictions can be mobilized. The evidence supporting this interpretation, the large-scale pattern's resistance to change, the moisture supply that shows no sign of depleting, the back-building convective organization that the HRRR is beginning to suggest is developing on the upwind flank of the current storm complex. The soil moisture analysis from the USDA showing the region already in an elevated antecedent moisture state before Storm 1 has finished running. Only one of these interpretations will be correct. The data that will determine which one is the boundary's persistence over the next 18 to 24 hours, the precise track wobble of the mid-level steering flow, and the rate at which local drainage systems recover between storm peaks. The WPC is watching those variables in real time. So are we. Strip it back to the confirmed evidence, and the picture is this. There is a stationary frontal boundary anchored by a slow-moving upper-level trough. The boundary is the geographic frame for this entire investigation. It has been in place for more than 2 days. The large-scale pattern that maintains it shows no convincing sign of disruption in the next 24 to 36 hours. 3 discrete storm systems are developing and tracking along that boundary. The first has already run or is running across the corridor. USGS stream gauges in the affected watershed are responding. Antecedent soil moisture conditions, already elevated before Storm 1's rainfall began, have now been driven to saturation levels that functionally eliminate infiltration capacity across the primary drainage basins in the training corridor. The second storm is approaching or is underway. The HRRR is showing the track. The WPC's excessive rainfall outlook has flagged the corridor with elevated probability of hydrologically significant rainfall. The NWS weather forecast offices along the corridor are in active warning operations. The third storm is still in the development phase. Its track is within the current model uncertainty envelope, which means its precise corridor and whether it overlaps fully, partially, or minimally with the tracks of storms 1 and 2 is still resolving. Those are the confirmed facts. Now, for what we don't know. We don't know whether the boundary will hold long enough for all 3 storms to track the same corridor, or whether the subtle pattern changes that could shift subsequent tracks are already developing at the subgrid scale. We don't know the precise watershed by watershed impact, which specific drainage basins will receive the full training sequence and which will escape it. We don't know how quickly emergency management resources will be able to recover between storm peaks, or how many water rescue assets will be available when the third event's flooding begins. We don't know what the fatality count will be, because it will be determined in real time by thousands of individual decisions. Decisions to get in a car or stay put. Decisions to take shelter upstairs or investigate the noise outside. Decisions made by people who may or may not have received an effective warning with enough time to act. And then there is the thing the silence tells us. The silence of the flood zone maps that don't cover where the worst flooding will occur. The silence of the design standards that weren't built for this event type. The silence of the communication apparatus that is optimized for the flood it has always had and not for the flood that training events produce. Here is what that silence means, practically. If you're in the forecast corridor for this storm sequence, and you can check the WPC's excessive rainfall outlook right now to know whether you are, the question you need to answer is not, am I in the flood zone? It is not, how bad was it the last time it flooded here? The question is, what is my elevation relative to every stream channel, culvert, storm sewer outlet, and paved road within a quarter mile of me? Because in a training flood, water doesn't stay where it has always been. It finds every path downhill that the topography offers, regardless of what the map says. Monitor NOAA weather radio, or the NWS app, or the alert system that pushes emergency alerts to your phone. Know now, before anything starts, what the upper floor of your building looks like and how quickly you can get there. Know your 2 exit routes from your neighborhood. Know that if water is moving across a road surface and you cannot see the pavement clearly, you cannot judge the depth or velocity from inside a vehicle, regardless of what the surface looked like 30 minutes ago. These are not dramatic actions. They are the practical outputs of understanding the mechanism. Understanding that the training event's lethality is specifically tied to the gap between what the warning system, the flood maps, and the public's risk perception are built to handle, and what this specific type of event actually produces. After the event, there will be an accounting. There always is, in some form. A post-event NWS service assessment, an after-action review from the State Emergency Management Agency, a FEMA disaster declaration if the damage meets the threshold, property damage tallies, in the worst case, a fatality count. What tends to emerge from these accountings consistently across training flood events is a particular frustration. The data was there. The atmospheric signal was there. The hydrological preconditions were documentable before the worst flooding began. What failed was not the science. What failed was the translation of the science into information that produced protective behavior at the individual level, at the infrastructure level, at the regulatory level, in the time that was available. The Association of State Floodplain Managers has been documenting this frustration since its founding. Their annual reports read like a patient, increasingly exhausted argument for the same suite of reforms. Updated flood maps that reflect current land use and current precipitation climatology, building codes that account for compound event flooding, infrastructure design standards that incorporate the actual range of events a watershed will experience, and communication strategies that reach people with accurate, location-specific, actionable information in the time available. Some of these reforms are happening. FEMA's Risk Rating 2.0 program, which launched in October 2021, represents the first fundamental overhaul of the NFIP's risk assessment methodology in decades. First Street Foundation's data is increasingly being used by local governments that have moved beyond FEMA maps for their planning purposes. The HRRR model continues to improve. NWS warning language is being refined based on social science research. The warning coordination meteorologists at NWS offices across the country are actively working on community-level risk communication. These are genuine improvements. They are not complete. They are not operating at the pace of the problem. And the problem, the compound event risk that training floods represent, is not static. As precipitation intensity increases at the high end of the distribution, as headwater watersheds continue to develop, as infrastructure continues to age, the gap between the flood risk that exists and the flood risk that institutions are communicating and preparing for does not narrow on its own. It requires sustained attention. It requires someone to keep watching the data. This is where the investigation stands. A stationary boundary. 3 storms on a fixed track. A drainage system that has been progressively compromised by each preceding event. A warning apparatus that is doing what it was designed to do while the event it is facing pushes against its design limits. Communities in the path that may not know they are in the path, because the map on the wall says they aren't. The story is not over when the 3rd storm clears. The recovery from a training flood event is its own investigation. The insurance claims that don't get paid because the property wasn't in the flood zone and the homeowner didn't carry flood insurance. The road repairs that restore the surface, but not the undersized culvert that failed beneath it. The FEMA individual assistance process that provides important but incomplete relief. The community conversations about whether to rebuild in place or acknowledge that the watershed geometry makes this location categorically vulnerable. We will be watching all of it. The real-time gauge data, the post-event NWS service assessment, the preliminary damage estimates, the fatality reports, the institutional responses, and the next setup that looks like this one, because there will be another one. The atmospheric pattern that produces training sequences is not rare. It is a recurring feature of the North American warm season. Understanding it in the detail that the evidence supports, not in the simplified form that most coverage provides, is the difference between preparation and surprise. The 3 storms are still lining up. The boundary is still in place. The ground is saturated. The drainage systems are stressed.
We will be here when it resolves. We will be here when the accounting begins, and we will keep asking the questions that the data demands, not because the answers are always comfortable, but because the gap between what we know and what we're told is exactly where stories like this live. Signal watch. We're watching.